Hello and welcome to the Varsity Tutors Historical Viewpoint Collection, where throughout the month of March, we're going to be honoring Women's History Month with classes for about all kinds of women heroes of American history. And today is no exception, and a really cool one as we honor female veterans and the many contributions, heroic, groundbreaking contributions that women have made in the military with our class on a salute to women in the military. And we've got our friends from Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania here. We've got Tim and Mike here to shed light on those contributions really throughout all of the eras from the Civil War onto the present, and tell you some pretty amazing stories that you'll be glad to have heard about. So a couple things before we turn it over to them. One, let's keep it interactive. They're going to ask you some questions to find out what you know and some of your experiences with female veterans. And one of the highlights of today will be a game of fact or fiction with one of the truest American heroes that I can imagine. We'll also give everyone an opportunity to take a selfie with that hero as well. So make sure you've got a camera nearby. And in about a half an hour, we'll have everybody get a chance to lean into the screen, take that selfie, and if you upload it to Instagram and tag Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum and Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win a prize package that includes a swag bag from the museum and 3 free months of VT Plus with Varsity Tutors. Also, make sure as you have any questions throughout the session, type those in the last 10 minutes or so. We'll get answers to all of your questions as I interview Tim and Mike with your questions. So with that all said, we've got a lot to cover here and, a lot of, I would imagine, new information and some great review for everyone as well. So let me turn it over to our hosts today, Tim and Mike from Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here. My name is Tim Neff. I'm the Director of Museum and Education at Soldiers and Sailors, and with me is
Michael Kraus. I'm the curator here at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum.
And thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are here to honor Women's History Month with our program called Saluting Women in the Military. We've got a class filled with information for you. We're going to start with a little bit of historical perspective, walking through different eras of history and looking at some of the roles that women have played during those eras. And then, as Brian said, we're going to also highlight a very interesting pioneer for women in the military a little bit later on, Teresa James, and we'll play a game of fact or fiction. And what you can see right now on the screen is the different sections that we'll be looking at today. We have a history of women in the military will be section 1, just like I said. Then we'll move on to section 2, which will be the game, fact or fiction about Teresa James. And then section 3 will be Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum. We'll talk a little bit about Soldiers and Sailors, what we're all about, and the artifacts that we have related to this topic. So we've got a lot to do, so we're going to jump right into it. And we're going to start with a question. Think about this for a minute. What are some of the roles that you think women have played in the military? Give that some thought here. Go ahead and type in your answers. We'll see what we get. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of answers coming through here. Nurses is definitely a big part of it. Yeah, we'll be talking some about nurses. Soldiers, yeah, and women have certainly been soldiers, especially in more modern times. Women are seeing a lot more combat situations. We have military intelligence. That's a great answer. That's a good one. Yeah. Cooks and secretaries, some of the more traditional roles have been filled, but that's going to be part of our historical perspective. But that's really what we're going to get at here, is how much that has changed and how these roles have evolved through the years. So some really good answers. A lot of those we will touch on as we go through the class here. But I think, like I said, the important thing to note is that these roles will change. I also want to just take this chance, and I might repeat this a couple times, but at the same time, when I say, how that roles have changed, all roles in the military are important. All right. Everybody thinks of soldiers and fighting in combat, and that's the main thing they do. But for every one soldier in the field fighting on the front lines, there's many, many soldiers supporting that one soldier. And all of those jobs have to be filled. And every job is important. If one person doesn't do their job, everything falls apart. So I don't want to, there's no reason to look at any job in the military as, oh, that's not very important. They are all very important, and they all can, contribute to saving lives and making soldiers' lives better on the front lines. So that was very good. We're going to go ahead and move on to the history of women in the military. We see a nice collage of different eras here we'll be talking about as we go along. And we're going to jump right in here to the Civil War. And when you talk about women in the Civil War, one of the first people that comes to many people's mind is who we're looking at right now is CLARA BARTON. And the question is, have you heard of CLARA BARTON, and what do you know about her? Okay, so Civil War, we're seeing that. Okay. Nursing is coming up again, which is very true. Yep.
Sure.
Red Cross, that's a
Yeah,
really
that's a
good
good one.
answer. We'll
That's
know
it.
why that's important here in a minute. She was certainly a women's rights activist. Yep. Very good. Yeah, looks like some people are familiar with her, which is fantastic. For those who aren't, though, I think we should spend a few minutes just talking about CLARA and how important she is. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike here, and he'll fill you in a little bit with how significant and important CLARA Barton was in the role she played in the war.
CLARA Barton's one of my favorite Civil War figures, not only because of how she took the initiative and went out on her own to find supplies, much needed supplies for Civil War soldiers. But also, when you think about her, here's a woman, she was 5'2". That's a tiny little person, really. And she became this huge force. And what she did was she had been a clerk in the patent office, and clerks at that time were hired because they had good handwriting, because there were no copying machines or computers. So all records that needed to be duplicated had to be copied by hand, and she was a clerk. So she was in Washington at the time of the Civil War, and when the first battle happened at Manassas, and she saw these streaming floods of wounded men coming back to Washington, she immediately volunteered to help. And she learned that there was a big need. The Army wasn't prepared for lots of casualties, and there was a huge need to get supplies to the front. And she took it upon herself to raise the money and gather the supplies and drive them to the Army in the front. And she became very well known, and she was a fixture on some battlefields. She was even had a bullet pass through her dress at Fredericksburg, which is how close she was to the action. She stayed at various posts during the war. Eventually, the Army kind of caught up with their supply chain, but it's in those early years of the war that she became so important and so valuable. And at the end of the war, she established an office in Washington, D.C., the Bureau of Missing Soldiers. And that was because when soldiers passed away, died, or were lost, they a lot of times didn't have any identification with them. And families were really trying to find those wounded soldiers. And she made it one of her tasks to find and search for them through the newspapers and mail and other things. So she became a very important person. And she stays in that field of helping, and she establishes the Red Cross, which is kind of what we know of her and about her. And she led and directed the Red Cross for many years, almost up until the time of her death in 1912. She was a huge figure. And not only the Red Cross here, but she was invited to be part of the International Red Cross overseas as well. So she's a big player.
I mean, you think about the Red Cross today, everybody's heard of it around the world, and it all traces back to this pioneer female in the Civil War, CLARA Barton. So pretty amazing stuff there. And we certainly want to give her credit for being one of the first ones out there. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next part we wanted to mention. And this is the Sanitary Fair and the U.S. Sanitary Commission. You're seeing some images from one of our exhibits here at the museum. And I'm going to let Mike talk about what you're looking at here and how important these organizations were to the Civil War.
So the Sanitary Commission is a grassroots organization that grows up kind of doing what CLARA was doing. What their mission was to raise money and to buy materials for Army hospitals. And not only that, but to manufacture a lot of things. And that work was primarily done by women. And women in the North were connected all over through these Sanitary Commission offices. And they held large fairs in some of the major cities in the US, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, are among some of the cities. And what these fairs were like, if you've ever been to a country fair where they had animals and crafts and things you could see, it was a big deal to come and see that. But a lot of women made crafts, like this box is one of them, and they were sold during the period of the fair. People would bid on these things, and all the money went to purchasing bandages, socks, underwear. You don't think about how important underwear is, blankets, medicines, and it was all primarily an organization where women did most of the work. In this box in our collection, you can see in the background, it has little trinkets glued onto it, and inside the contents were these medicines and powders that you see in the photograph.
Yeah, so right away you're seeing maybe these women weren't necessarily serving in the military per se, but they were certainly doing all they could to contribute, and they were finding ways to contribute and even inventing ways.
They were fulfilling this need that they saw that wasn't being taken care of.
Yeah. But as we move on to the next one, we'll start to see, a little closer step to women, serving in the military. And this is Marie TEPE Leonard. And she held the position of a vivandière. Vivandière.
Yeah.
I always have trouble with that one. Which is an interesting position, and once again, like I said, gets her a little bit closer to the action, if you will. So why don't we tell us a little bit about her?
Sure. Mary TEPE Leonard was French. In fact, she was called French Mary. Some regiments, this particular one she belonged to, had these women in military costume called vivandières, because again, they were styled after the French model overseas, at which those regiments all had vivandières. She wears a cask on her hip, and that's full of rum.
She was popular.
Yeah, she was very popular, because during a battle or a heated march or severe conditions, a little rum was considered a stimulant, and it helped the guys kind of shake off some cold or a cough and keep moving. And she traveled with her husband. Her husband's last name was Leonard, in this Pennsylvania regiment until she was cited for. She was in several battles. She was cited for gallantry, and I don't know if you can see on her chest, she has like a cross, and that was a medal that was awarded to her called the Carney Cross. It was a medal for gallantry. She's one of the only women to receive that medal. She eventually got out of the Army, married another man, ended up here in Pittsburgh, and operated a candy store here until her death.
Okay, and then if we take that one more step further, we have the very interesting story, which many people may have heard of before, of women actually trying to pass themselves off as men so they could serve. These were women that, felt very strongly about wanting to serve in the Union Army in this case, and they were going to do it at all costs. And one of the most famous ones, it's hard to document a lot of these stories and hard to put a number on how many women actually did this, but one of the more famous and well-known stories of this is Sarah Wakeman.
Yeah, Sarah Wakeman belonged to a New York regiment. And well, let me first say, there were a number of women who joined the Union Army disguised as men, and the Confederate Army as well. Some joined to be near their husbands, but once they were discovered, as you can imagine, in camp with close quarters, it was hard to hide whether you were the fact that you were a woman. When they were discovered, they were dismissed and sent home. And some just were never discovered, like Sarah. She posed as a man. She was never discovered. She fought in a number of battles. We know about her because her letters survive. And she was taken ill in 1864 and died, and is buried in a national cemetery among the other male soldiers. So this was a way for women, although not an endorsed way, not an official way, but some women really wanted to serve, and Sarah was one of them, and she gave her life for her country.
So as you can see, the Civil War, we're really trying to, just start to define these roles and different ways that women can help out and do their part. And some of these women are defining them on their own or coming up with their own ways to help out. As we move into the next part of this, which will be World War I, these roles start to get a little bit more defined, especially when it comes to nurses. Of course, now we have the Red Cross, so there's more, kind of structure to the nursing system just through the Red Cross alone. There's also the nickname thrown out there, and you're seeing that in the poster there of donut dollies. You see the young lady there with a plate full of donuts, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's go ahead and jump right in. What can you tell us about the? Well, let's start with the Hello Girls here. Another interesting group that does not get very much credit for what they did in World War I.
It's another way women found to serve, or a door that was open, let's say.
Yeah.
Because there are certainly many who wanted to serve, but couldn't find that door, wasn't available to them. Telephones were a pretty recent invention, and they made their way over, the technology made its way over to France in World War I with our American troops. And there was a shortage of switchboard operators. Calls had to be routed through a board. You see these women sitting in front of a board, and a call would come in, and they'd have to take one wire and plug it into a hole corresponding to another, which would lead the call somewhere. So there was such a huge need that women were recruited into the Army to be in the Signal Corps, it was called, to be telephone operators. And there were about 200 of them that traveled to France. It helped if you could speak French and English, because the communications would go sometimes to the French, between the lines between the French commanders and the American commanders and the British commanders. And this was really an opening that a lot of women were qualified because they were operators here in this country and took that talent overseas. And they were known as the Hello Girls because they had very nice voices, and they were efficient, and they were the ones who greeted these communications. And these communications went right up to the battlefield. There were little telephone stations right inside the trenches in the headquarters. So a very valuable position that women filled as Army soldiers in the Signal Corps.
So this is a big distinction now, that these are for the first time women serving in uniform, actually joining the Army to serve. And it's because, like Mike said, I mean, they were performing a duty that it would take so long to train men to do this job. These women already knew how to do it, and the Army weighed the options here. Do we try to go through all the training with the men to get them caught up, or do we use these women, especially those that could bilingual, speak French and English, use them to fill these very important positions in the Signal Corps as telephone operators? Before we move on from World War I, though, I want to touch back on the donut dollies. I think they are kind of interesting. It's a neat nickname. We saw that image of them a couple slides ago. What can you tell us about them?
Well, they were not Army personnel, but another way to connect with the Army and to be of use was to join the American Red Cross. And the Red Cross sent numerous teams overseas in World War I. And one of their duties was to run these donut and coffee stands, which were just back from the front. Like soldiers would live in trenches for a month or several weeks, and then they'd be rotated back for rest. And when they got to the rear, they would be treated to hot coffee and donuts by these American women from the American Red Cross. So they were called donut dollies. And that name actually extended into World War II as well.
Yeah, and that's going to bring us to World War II. And kind of playing off of the Hello Girls, women are going to be invited once again to join what we're going to call these women auxiliary units. And they're going to be in uniform, serving in different capacities. And we're going to talk about that. But the well-known auxiliary units we're looking at here are the WAC, the Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, the Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Services. That was kind of like the Navy.
Yes.
The WASP, the Women Air Service Pilots, which
we'll
keep that one in mind, for Teresa James coming up a little later on. And the SPARs, which were the Coast Guard component, the auxiliary unit for the Coast Guard. And SPARs stood for Semper Paratus, Always Ready, which is a Latin phrase that they were using. So these units were very new, like I said, because it's women in the uniform, and it's filling some of the support jobs. But when I keep saying support jobs, let's think about what some of those could mean. And let's kick that off with a question. What do you think some jobs are? What do you think the jobs you think women did in these auxiliary units? What were some of these support jobs that you think they did? So take a minute, think about that.
Very important jobs.
Yes. We're seeing a Women's Army Corps recruiting poster right there now. Are you a girl with a star-spangled heart? Encouraging women to sign up for the Women's Army Corps to fulfill some of these jobs. And what do we see there?
Thousands of jobs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm seeing secretaries again. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. There's a lot of that administrative work that needs to be done for a military. So yes, secretaries. Equipment repair. That was one. Yep. Photographers. Nurses are coming up again. I think it is important to note that nurses were taking on even a more specified, medical and surgical technician roles, where that, once again, we're just honing that down, those positions and those roles down to very specific jobs that, these women can fulfill. Communications, carrying over from the Hello Girls, they were still handling a lot of communications. Supply officers, That was another one. So there was a lot of these jobs, and it takes me back to what I mentioned earlier about for every one soldier in the field, you need to have so many soldiers supporting them. And the idea with these auxiliary units was to allow women to serve, fill the supporting roles, and take the men that used to have to do those jobs and allow them to move on to the front lines to serve in combat. So this was just another big step to getting, more participation of women in the military. And I say all that, but I just want to point out, one thing that with the Hello Girls and even with these auxiliary units, there was a lot of effort after the wars for them to gain the recognition they deserved,
Yeah, they really weren't given the compensation or the military credit that they deserved.
Right.
Yeah, and it took a long time.
Yeah, it was a long fight to receive the benefits and everything that you would imagine all our veterans receiving. Some of these women's, the Hello Girls were the pioneers, and then some of these auxiliary units had to fight for those. And that's going to come back once again to our star, Teresa James, a little bit later on. But one of the other jobs that you don't think about that was being filled here was code breaking. This is Julia Parsons from Pittsburgh, and she was a code breaker in the Waves. And what you're looking at is a picture of Julia and a picture of something called the Enigma machine. So in World War II, the Germans developed this Enigma machine to pass messages. It was basically an early computer, and was considered the unbreakable code. Well, it certainly was unbreakable until the Allies captured one of these machines. Once it was captured, it could be used to start decoding these. However, every day the codes changed. So it took a team, a mountain of people to be thrown at this task of trying to decode these messages every day. And some of those people were women like Julia Parsons, who worked in an office in Washington, D.C. And I've heard her speak about, each day they were looking for little clues to figure out the messages. And what they were really trying to do was identify U-boats in the ocean, where they were, and help direct our supplies around them. So she was doing a very important, significant job, saving lives and getting supplies, helping to get supplies to the troops.
And not allowed to talk about.
And not allowed to talk about. That's my favorite footnote to this story, is she was told not to speak about anything that she did in the military, and spent most of her life not telling anybody until she saw one of these machines in a museum, and she couldn't believe it. She thought, well, how can this be? Nobody should know about this. And once she found out that, they'd been declassified and it was okay to talk about it, she actually went home and for the first time told her own husband what she did in the war. So just think about that.
She kept her vow.
Yeah, she truly took that so seriously that what she was doing was top secret, which it was at the time. And she followed through on that. So I just wanted to share that story. I've met her on multiple occasions, and she just turned, I think 101 just a couple weeks ago. So I'm very honored to have met her, and just wanted to share her story. The next story we have here from the World War II era is Frances Slanger. And I want to turn this back over to Mike to tell us a little bit about her.
Frances Slanger was an Army nurse in World War II. She was an immigrant. She was born in Poland in 1920 and came here with her family. She studied nursing, became a nurse before the Second World War, in the years before the Second World War. When the war came, she wanted to go to help soldiers, to nurse wounded soldiers. So that was her path, and she ended up in the 45th Field Hospital, which she was one of 4 nurses to land on the D-Day beaches, not during combat, of course, but once the beaches were secured, she was one of 4 female nurses that devoted and started to set up this 45th Field Hospital. She continued to work with the hospital in Belgium, and in October of 1944, she wrote a letter. She was very scholarly. I mean, she was very intelligent, liked to write. She wanted to be a writer as well as a nurse. So she penned her first article to Stars and Stripes. That was the newspaper that served the military over there. And on the 21st, she sent it out to be received, and then whether it was accepted or not, she would come to learn later. But on that very same day, her hospital was shelled by German artillery, and it was supposed to be a safe place. The tents were clearly marked. There had never been fire directed against them before, but there was an artillery barrage, and in that barrage, she was mortally wounded and died. And just days after she died, her article was published in Stars and Stripes. And the content was just very glowing about how hard our soldiers fight and what they think of home and what they miss. It was a very moving letter. And to think that she wrote it, sent it out, and then was killed is also a very tragic story. Now, she turns out to be the only American nurse killed in combat in World War II. And in her honor, a hospital ship was named the Francis Y. Slanger hospital ship, which, as you see in front of us, we have a small model of that ship. It's rather primitive, but it also has a story. It was made, there was an Army nurse from Pittsburgh who was serving in the years right at the end of the war in 1945 and 46. And one of her stations was treating German prisoners of war. And one of the German prisoners of war made this model for her. And she was able to get it home from Europe and bring it home, where it stayed in her basement for decades. and she donated it to us. But it's a wonderful piece recalling her service, and also it allows us to tell the story of Francis Slanger.
We pulled this out of one of our exhibits just for the class tonight.
Yeah.
It is usually on permanent on display in the museum, so we do share this story. So yeah, as we can see, you know, we're ramping up the participation here and the levels of participation, and that brings us to Teresa James, who I just want to mention right now to put her in the context of history and where she fits in their timeline. Teresa James was a pilot in World War II in the Women Air Service pilots. We're going to learn a lot more about her a little bit later on, but I just wanted to fit her in here. You can see her in her plane there, just so you understood that, you know, she's fitting in this World War II era, because now we're going to move on to one more kind of historical section, which is women in the modern military. And this is going to be where some of the biggest changes are happening and still happening today. You know, kind of 1978 is one very important date. That's when, you know, the women are integrated into the Army for the first time, basically getting rid of the idea of the auxiliary unit and, you know, integrating them in the Army. However, combat roles still does not come until a little bit later on. But we have a couple other, you know, more modern era women we'd like to highlight. And the first one is ELAINE Berkowitz, who is a part of our collection and a very good friend of ours. And I'll let Mike tell us a little bit about her.
Sure. Elaine joined the Army as an enlisted person in 1974. And she worked her way up through the ranks and eventually put herself through medical school, dental school. And once she graduated from dental school, she was commissioned as an officer. So she served as a military dentist for the rest of her career. But that role took her to Serbia, and it also took her to Iraq. And she is quite a person. She serves on our board, and you see her here outside of Humvee on the left, and that's her military uniform when she retired on the right. And she's still serving.
Yeah.
Elaine is still serving, and we're very proud to have her as part of our story and as a member of our board.
And I think, you know, that's a role we haven't even mentioned yet, is dentistry.
Yeah,
and dentists in the military.
The doctors, dentists.
Yeah, it's all very important. You got to make sure you take care of those teeth.
Yeah.
If you're going to be a good soldier. So that's Elaine. And then we want to move on to our next one here is LOIS Shirley. And I'll let Mike talk a little bit about her.
Yeah, Lois Shirley, we pick her also because she has a relationship with us. She is also a member of our board of directors. Lois was an Army nurse who served in Vietnam. You know, a lot of times you think of nurses being out in the front lines. Well, she was not in the front lines. She was in a hospital in Saigon, which is where a lot of soldiers, once they've been treated in the frontline hospitals and evacuated out, would come to Saigon for their recovery and post medical follow-up. So she served not only in Vietnam, but she continued in the Army and retired as a lieutenant colonel. And she is also, again, a great example of a woman who dedicated her life as a nurse to the military. And we're proud to know her and proud to have her on our board.
And that's going to bring us to modern combat roles. And this is, you know, ever changing. I mean, this is, we're truly talking about almost current events at this point. But you can see some important information here. In 2013, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta removed the military ban on women serving in combat. So that's the very first little step to women being on the front lines. And by October of 2019, over 1,000 women were serving in combat specialties, and 653 women had completed training and were serving in combat. And basically at this point, more women are serving in the military than ever before. And that just shows, you know, how much this has evolved and has changed through the years. And it's going to be the new reality. And you know, we're going to see more and more of this, I think.
And look how far we've come. If you just look back to, you know, CLARA, where women are trying to find a way to help, to where some women are dressing as men and serving, to where women are experts in communication and are coming into the Army. And we build ourselves all the way up to here where now they're in combat roles, which is not only just in combat roles, but that's a big hurdle to cross over, but in the other specialties as well, and a big part of the military.
Yep. So we've seen quite a bit of evolution here. And that's going to bring us back to, as I mentioned, Teresa James and what we're considering a pioneer, you know, of women in the military, and for that matter, women in aviation. And we're going to play a game of fact or fiction. So we're going to put a fact, or a statement, I should say, up on the screen, and I'll read it aloud. And it's up to you as our audience to try to find out if that is true or false. Is it fact or fiction? And I think you'll find after the end of this that she was a pretty amazing woman. And she truly was one of our heroes. And as we say, sheroes is the new way to say the sheroes of women in the military. So let's take a look at our first one here, a fact or fiction. Teresa James overcame her fear of flying in order to impress a man named Bill, who she had a crush on. Kind of sounds like a bit of...
a dinosaur novel.
Yeah, exactly. Something you'd see on TV or something. But believe it or not, this is actually a fact. Her fear of flying came from the fact that she was around flying a lot as a young person. She witnessed a crash, a very terrible crash as a young person. And her brother was also in a separate crash where he survived. But you have these things coming together, and she kind of builds this early fear of flying. But she overcomes that fear, and she takes her first flight in 1933. She's right away showing how she's strong she is to overcome. I know, you know, for a lot of us that have a fear of heights or something like that, it's not easy to overcome something like that. And not only is she going to overcome it, but she's going to move on to our next one, which is she goes on to become a stunt pilot with the nickname Female Flyer. And she became known for her signature move, the barrel roll.
Is this fact or fiction?
Is it fact or fiction? Let's see. What do we think? Give everybody a chance to give that some thought, and we'll find out that that is actually fiction. But not as much as you might think. She did become a stunt pilot. Her nickname was Girl Stunt Pilot, and she was known for a signature move, but her signature move was a 26-turn spin.
Oh my gosh.
Which all I can imagine is that as a plane in a dead spin, spinning around 26 times before it recovers and flies back up. So once again, although this statement isn't exactly all true, it's still very close and shows, you know, how far she's coming along with her piloting skills, if you will. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. And this is Teresa James took up speed skating on a dare from her fellow pilots and became a competitive speed skater, eventually competing in the Olympics. So that's a little different. That shows that she has a little bit of guts to take it on a dare, if this is true, if it is true, of course.
Sounds like she likes to go fast.
Yes, she does, yep. And the fact is, this is not true. This is fiction. But once again, I think you're going to see here, there's a little bit of truth in all of them. Even though this is fiction, she did take up speed skating on a dare, and she became very competitive at it. And she does compete in the Pennsylvania Skating Association's championship meet. So not quite the Olympic level, but still, once again, taking this up on a dare and becoming a pretty competitive speed skater even after she's a pilot. So, just amazing, interesting tidbits about just one person here. Teresa James earned her commercial pilot license in 1941, and she became the first woman to graduate from the Buffalo Aeronautical Institute. Fact or fiction? And this one is indeed a fact.
Okay.
This is all true. She got her commercial pilot license, which commercial flight was still very new in 1941. So for anybody to get their license was a big deal, but especially for a female to get it and to graduate from the Buffalo Aeronautical Institute. Just like a lot of the other women we're talking about, she was probably the only woman in around at the time, but she was so dedicated to flight in this case and to wanting to fly that she was going to do what it took to get there.
And look at the date, 1941. That's
Yeah,
going to
very
rolling
true.
right up against.
Right. To the major event and kind of the next part of her life, which is going to be during World War II. Teresa James was one of the first women invited to join the Women's Auxiliary Flying Squadron, the WAFSs. That eventually became the Women Air Service Pilots. Is that true? Is that fact or is that fiction? And that one is a fact. That one is all true. All right. There was we hadn't mentioned the WAFs earlier, but that was just the really earlier incarnation of the WASPs. And one of the biggest jobs for the WASP pilots was to ferry planes, which means they took them from, one base to another base to get them to where they needed to go to be used in combat. She wasn't flying in combat. She wasn't, doing that, but she was getting the planes where they needed to go. And what that means is she could fly any plane that was being built, fighter plane, bomber, whatever it was, she could get in it and fly it. And all the women, I think there was about 25 or so of these WASP pilots that could fly any type of plane that was being manufactured.
Pretty remarkable when you think about it.
All right, let's move on to our next one. 3 months prior to joining the war effort, Teresa James married George Martin, who became a bomber pilot and survived the war. Fact or fiction? Another great photo of her on her plane there. But now we're talking a little bit more about her significant other, George Martin. Just like a lot of folks in this time period, they got married before they went off to war. And this is indeed fiction. She does marry George Martin. However, the sad side is he does not survive the war. He was shot down and declared missing in action and eventually declared dead. And unfortunately, the story goes that James does not actually know the full story of what happened to her husband until 1984, when she actually got to meet the twin sons who pulled Martin from the wreckage on June 22nd, 1944. So she still was living with that question that he could be alive. I mean, she had been declared dead, but there was no final closure to this until 1984, when she got that story from the people that were actually there at the crash site. Okay, our next one. Teresa James became the first woman to be assigned a long-distance solo mission as she flew a military aircraft from Maryland to California. Fact or fiction? And this one is fact. All right, one of her biggest claims to fame is this feat of flying across the country in a military aircraft. She completed that and should get credit as once again, as that pioneer of women in military and women in aviation. So we'll move on here. In 1950, Teresa James was commissioned a major in the United States Air Force, and she eventually retired in 1976. So that would mean she truly made a career of that. If this is fact. Is it fact or is it fiction? And this one is indeed a fact. That is true. She did become a major and eventually retired in 1976. So she did make a career out of it and spent a lot more years serving and flying airplanes in the military. We'll move on to the next one here. Teresa James spent much of her life fighting for WASPs to be recognized with veteran status. And WASPs were indeed recognized in 1976. And once again, fact or fiction, this one is a fact. All right, this one is true. After much fighting and efforts, they were recognized. We talked a little bit about that earlier on. A lot of these auxiliary units were not recognized, did not gain the benefits that most veterans did. And Teresa James, just like many of her counterparts before her, had to fight for those rights, and she spearheaded that throughout most of her career. All right. When the Grumman Corporation heard Teresa say in a Top Flight, which was a CBS documentary about the Air Force, that the only thing she had not flown was a jet, the company arranged for her to fly an F-14. Fact or fiction? You see an F-14 there. This is going to be a much more modern plane than she'd ever flown.
Way different than anything she's
All right.
known to have flown.
Kind of hard to believe this one could actually be fact,
Yeah.
but once again, indeed, this is a fact. In the late 1980s, after this documentary aired on CBS, someone at the Grumman Corporation made this happen for her, and she was able to fly an F-14 that late in her life. So we talked about how she could fly everything in World War II.
Yeah.
Well, here she is, even flying more modern aircraft in the 1980s. All right. Teresa James continued to fly until the age of 75. Fact or fiction? What do we think here? This one is actually fiction. This is not true. I think you'll be impressed. The true fact of this is she flew until the age of 86.
Oh my gosh.
So once again, even in these fictional statements, we're finding, some pretty amazing information about this individual. And she was able to fly all the way into her 80s until the age of 86. And we have one more for us, which is Teresa James's WAF's uniform is currently on display at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum, and her flight suit is part of the collection of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Fact or fiction? And as it turns out, this one is fiction, but I think you've all caught on to the theme here. There's a lot of elements to truth to it. Really, all we need to do here to make this a fact is switch around which uniforms are on display at which location. So her flight suit is a part of the collection on display at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall Museum, where we are. And that's actually what we're looking at in that photo. That's her flight suit that you're looking at there. And her uniform, her WAF's uniform, is currently a part of the collection at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. So kind of speaks to her significance that something of hers would be at the Smithsonian. And of course, here at Soldiers and Sailors, we're extremely honored to be able to have her her flight suit on display and share her story with all the tours that go by, because like I keep saying, she truly was a pioneer. If you talk about women in the military, I can only imagine some of the hardships she faced. I'm sure it was not easy. I am sure there are a lot of people who did not think women could fly planes or should be allowed to fly airplanes. And it was women like Teresa James that proved them wrong. Women like even back to CLARA BARTON proving people wrong, that they could do what's necessary and find ways to help and do what they could. I think that's what this is all about here. Facing that adversity and, fulfilling these roles, becoming role models for other young ladies, becoming these sheroes that can be looked up to. And hopefully what it'll lead to will only be more women in the military and, more, basically where we won't even really have a difference here. Women will be doing all the things that men can do and serving their country with honor. And we should, owe them the same respect we do to all our veterans.
It's a very proud tradition.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And of course, that's what Soldiers and Sailors is about, is paying homage and tribute to all of our veterans and men and women who have served our country. We've been, the building there that you're looking at where we are sitting inside of right now was built back in 1910 as a Civil War memorial. But today, as I said, stands for Memorial for All Veterans. And we're so lucky to have a collection of artifacts that have been donated to us through the years that we use to interpret the stories of these men and women that served our country. Artifacts like our ship here and some other things we've shown you through these episodes. And if you are in the area and you ever want to come and visit us, right now we are open by appointment only. You can call and get an appointment for a guided tour of our museum. Hopefully here shortly, fingers crossed, we'll be able to open up for walk-in and regular business again, but you can still make an appointment to see us if you're ever in the Pittsburgh area. And I think you'd be very impressed with the collection that we have, the stories that we have that we've shared some with you along the way here. And we really hope you've enjoyed learning all about women in the military in today's class. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Brian and see where we're at from here.
Thank you guys. Yeah, just really amazing stories throughout. My new hero, what I want to be when I grow up is Teresa James. What an unbelievable
We
story.
can only wish that we could be
Yeah,
that.
I think one of the most popular is, as people have questions, people have been sending in a bunch of them. So we're going to do Q&A in just a second. One of the most popular ones is have you met Teresa James? So we'll save that for Q&A. But right now, we do want to give everybody an opportunity to lean into the screen and get a selfie with Teresa James herself. So I'm going to put that up. Remember, as you're grabbing those cameras, I want to make sure you guys know the rules. If you upload it to Instagram, tag Soldiers and Sailors and tag Varsity Tutors, you will be entered to win your very own Soldier and Sailor swag bag and 3 free months of BT Plus, which is a place where you can get close to being as cool as Teresa James by learning all kinds of amazing things through, basically take any class that you want to, with dozens of classes available every week. So if you want to learn more about it, click the link on your screen. But without further ado, let me put Teresa James up on the screen and turn myself off so you can get a picture with one of the greatest American heroes I think any of us can imagine. All right. Hopefully everybody got those pictures, and we'll make sure we have all those instructions up for you on the way out. But you guys have been asking some questions, so let's get you some answers. And like I said, one of the most common ones: have you guys met Teresa James? I know you have some of her belongings there.
Yeah, I have not met her. I've met a lot of people who have met her, but I personally had not met her before. No.
Nor have I. I've been here 15 years. You've been here a little longer, and we knew some of the older staff that had met her, and she'd been here a number of times.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing her story for us. Just, truly amazing. One of the other real common questions we got a lot of was just sort of, even if it wasn't questions, it was kind of commentary like, hey, why would we have wasted the talents of, dozens, hundreds, thousands of women like Teresa James by not getting them more involved in World War I or Civil War, or even World War II? She was kind of the anomaly. So I guess the question I'll spin that into is, isn't leveraging more women in the military a huge competitive advantage, and have any countries really been kind of ahead of the game on recognizing that if you can double or maybe more your brain power, your horsepower, you've got a real competitive advantage?
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, it's been social history that's kept women from participating on equal footing, and thank goodness we're coming out of that, and we're learning to put some of that aside, and women certainly are equal. And yes, we have lost a lot of time and footing, and there are other countries. I mean, one that pops in my head is Israel has compulsory military service for men and women, and they're a big part of the military, both visually and behind the scenes there. And I see us as coming on par with that as far as combat troops and those kind of women serving in that branch.
Yeah, and I think I just kind of thought of something when we were talking about that. We didn't mention something during World War II about the home front.
Yeah. And
you talk about the social kind of perception and roles of women. That was another significant, moment here, because we have the Rosie the Riveter character, that we did not put in the show today, but we can touch on, the women working in the factories. Up to that point, it was pretty much unheard of for women even to work in a factory, to even,
outside the home.
Yeah, or even have, a job of that sort. And of course, the need arose, and these women fulfilled those needs. And after the war was over, a lot of those women said, I like this work. I like making money, and I don't, necessarily need to go back to, the traditional roles of women. So, World War II, Teresa was doing it in the military, but even women back home were just beginning to change the shape and the look of those roles that women play just in society in general.
To break those barriers.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I was just on the FaceTime call the other day with my grandmother who turned 18 the day of Pearl Harbor, and immediately went out to work working on the trains and kind of shuffling troops around and being part of the big logistical operation of mobilizing for war. So thank you guys for shedding light on so many of those really important support jobs to get soldiers where they need to go, get equipment made and where it needs to go is so crucial. And so often women have performed those roles and maybe not gotten the credit because it was behind the scenes. And so I'm really glad you guys shined a lot of light on that. One other question for you. I know that, the museum was sort of, built to honor the Civil War. So we may not have gone back as far. Do you guys have much information on women's roles in the Revolutionary War? A lot of people wanted to know about that.
We don't. We start our collection and our story with the Civil War. So, personally, as a historian, I know facts about women in the Revolutionary War, but at the museum, we don't cover that area of history. We start right at the Civil War.
Great, thank you. One last question for you guys. We got a lot of, it was early on, and then I think, ELAINE Berkowitz showed us that could be true, and definitely Teresa James. A lot of questions about, can women be officers? Can women be generals, commanders, all those kinds of things? Do you know much about, what are the highest ranks that women have risen to? And, can you just talk a little bit about, were there times that, big kind of tipping points where women were able to become officers? What do we know about that?
Well, it's been in the pretty recent past, I'm going to say 20, 25 years that women have broken that ceiling and become generals. Generals have to be appointed by Congress. It's just not, a job opportunity and somebody fills it. It's a long planned out process, and then appointment by Congress, because there are only so many roles open, so many ranks open. But yeah, you're seeing a lot of women 4-star generals. You're seeing admirals. You're seeing women on the big command situations, not just in nursing or traditional women's roles, but in very prominent military positions as senior generals and commanding officers.
And I think if you take a look at that moment of, like we mentioned, 1978, that's the first time women are really integrated into the regular army. So from there, you have to start the clock of when do these women kind of work their way up through the ranks and establish themselves to where they could reach those heights. And that is another reason why it's such a newer phenomenon. But at this point today, as we stand, 4-star general, admiral, it's all being occupied by women.
Great. And Commander-in-Chief coming sometime soon in our lifetime. So that glass ceiling is not looking shatterproof, and that's a good thing. So, hey, thanks to all of you. Thanks to everyone for watching. If you see a level that women in the military haven't risen to yet, that's take the Teresa James angle to it and just see it as a challenge to move up higher and higher. So huge thanks to our friends at Soldiers and Sailors. Thanks to everyone for all of your participation and questions. I won't ask anyone to publicly post their score on fact or fiction, but it was a tricky game, but a fun game, and definitely even the fictional ones highlighted that Teresa James is even more impressive than fiction. So huge thanks to you guys, and I know we'll see you back here soon, and for everyone else, we'll see you back here soon as well. So as promised, here are those instructions to get your photos uploaded for the contest. We look forward to seeing all of your smiling faces there with Teresa James up on Instagram here soon. And we'll see you back at Varsity Tutors for more great classes as soon as maybe tomorrow. So thank you, everybody.